This is Radio Now 95.3 FM. Come for the news, stay for informed conversations.
Hello and welcome to News Extra on your Beyond the News station, Radio Now 95.3 FM, Lagos. I'm Stephen Imediego, joined this morning by Nabila Usman, my co-host, as we look to the Middle East. The United States of America has launched a series of airstrikes targeting Iran's nuclear facilities in what is being described as the biggest Western military action against the Islamic Republic since its 1979 revolution. Key figures within the Iranian leadership have indicated that diplomatic solutions will only be employed after Tehran has retaliated against the strikes on its territory. This could include attacks on U.S. military bases in the region. Joining the conversation on News Extra is Irina Sukerman, who is an international security affairs analyst. Ms. Sukerman, thank you so much for joining us on the conversation.
Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm glad to be here.
Now, considering how much time has passed since the U.S. strikes, do you still expect a retaliation from Iran?
Well, earlier today, Iran announced that they're planning to close down the Strait of Hormuz, which in theory would be huge economic damage for everybody. In practice, that statement was vague and non-committal. What does the full closure of Strait of Hormuz mean? It means significant amount of resources spent on attacking the passing ships. Actually, a lot of that has been ongoing with the Houthis, who haven't stopped firing at Western ships, causing many of them to avoid the drought in order not to put themselves in danger and to avoid skyrocketing insurance costs. So for Iran, that would mean additional expenditures to put their own resources in, if they so wish, or if they're planning to piggyback off the Houthi success, then it wouldn't really be anything that they haven't already been doing. So far, that has been the only clear sign of retaliation that they announced, and it is expected that if the shutdown is complete and they put in so many ships firing at other vessels that no one can pass at all, that at some point the international community, especially the US, will take some action to put an end to this activity. The Iranian RGC vessels are ideal for asymmetrical warfare, for trapping large ships such as American warships in the area, so they could harass and cause damage, but in the end, if the U.S. decides to use deadly force against them, they're no match for U.S. firepower, and they're easier to get than the Houthis operating from land.
So, Ms. Sukerman, there are questions on the extent to which the U.S. is ready to commit to a prolonged war against Iran. And I ask this because Israel has retained a rhetoric that says even if Iran decides to back down now, their objective is to obliterate its nuclear capabilities. And they claim that this will also help them achieve their objectives in Gaza. Now, since the bombardments, particularly at the Fordow nuclear plant, the facility, there are claims that the U.S. did not actually make a significant enough dent, especially since atomic agencies across the UN one and some regional ones are all saying that there is no increase in radiation levels. So it does beg the question of the impact of the attacks that they carried out just a few days ago.
Well, in terms of the physical impact, I expect it to be quite significant, given the sheer amount of explosives that rain down on those facilities. But I think the concern is different. It's not whether there was some damage, because in theory, any amount of damage sets back the program, but whether the uranium and the materials used for the programs were actually there. Now, the problem is the U.S. issued a warning to the Iranians to evacuate the facilities 2 days before launching the strikes, and there may have been additional advance warnings even before that at various stages of the conflict, including when President Biden threatened to strike Iran. So there is evidence that there were trucks presumably moving the material out of the way. One way to interpret it is to protect the area from nuclear radiation, but another is to cover up the program and to move it somewhere where it's going to be harder to reach. Now, the big question is if those trunks were indeed documented, where were they actually going, and is the program still safe somewhere in Iran or outside the country? If that is the case, then the strikes against the facilities were more symbolic than anything else. They're still damaging and costly, and they're still setting back some of the Iranian nuclear capabilities, but not nearly as much as to prevent them from functioning quickly if they have other sites, secret sites, prepared to engage very quickly.
So, with the position of the U.S., the strikes we've seen over the weekend, they are still, well, I guess the concern now is how much further the U.S. could take its attacks on Iran. We know that there's been an evacuation of diplomatic personnel in the region. There's also been calls on American civilians within the region to lay low or leave the region as quickly as possible. Are we going to see an escalation? We've seen airstrikes. We're talking boots on ground. Is this a possibility from the U.S.?
I think boots on the ground are extremely unlikely. I think it's very close to zero. Can we see additional airstrike? That depends. First of all, the evacuations were ordered to prevent personnel being harmed by any potential Iranian retaliation, which is not expected to be very significant given the disparity in sources, but could happen due to proxy presence. And it also gives more freedom of action to the U.S. Second, President Trump made it very clear that the attacks on the nuclear sites were a one-off event. They were not expected to be a long-term engagement at all for many legal and political reasons. And even that was an enhancement from the original plan to only strike the Fordo facility. However, all of that can change in many ways, depending on whether Iran does actually physically attack any U.S. sites or personnel, whether the nuclear program is deemed to be still functioning, whether Iran decides ultimately to come to the negotiating table, and whether there are other concerns and immediate assistance that U.S. allies in the region might need, or Iran threatens or shows any other sort of dangerous activity aside from the nuclear program in the near future. For instance, let's say they do decide to send additional sources to the Strait of Hormuz and launch direct attacks there. U.S. could choose to intervene and shut that down as well.
So, Ms. Zuckerman, we know, I mean, you're in the U.S. yourself, and some of the things that we've seen coming out of there is some opposition political figures who have questioned President Donald Trump's one-sided, unanimous, one-sided, let's call it that, one-sided decision to carry out these airstrikes. In fact, Vice President J.D. Vance does say that he himself didn't know when the president had taken the decision. We understand that the U.S. Constitution mandates the president to get approval from Congress before he carries this out. Can you speak to us on those dynamics, how they're playing out, whether you think that U.S. lawmakers will make the president pay? And I use that quite cautiously.
Well, that's actually quite a complicated legal and constitutional discussion for the simple reason that, yes, the president is required to gain approval for declaration of war from Congress, but the U.S. has not actually declared war on anyone officially in many decades. And Congress has also not asserted its own powers in that regard and has not demanded additional executive appeal before more limited military action. In fact, there has been a long and bipartisan tradition of Congress essentially rubber stamping authorization for counterterrorism actions of various sorts. And there is a very common legal interpretation that the U.S. president is not required to get congressional permission for individual limited military actions like a one-off strike of the sort that we witnessed. So for that reason, it's very unlikely that Congress is going to have very significant objections or grounds for any sort of legal action against the executive branch. I'm sure that the opposition and anyone opposed to that really inside the Republican Party as well may try to use that argument, but it's not an argument that has been conventionally applied and under either party in power.
Right. So, as far as the split in terms of opinions regarding the U.S. position on the Iranian conflict is concerned, there were pictures that came out of the Situation Room over the weekend during the strikes on the 3 nuclear facilities in Iran. But one key figure was missing. The Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, had disagreed with the president's position on Iran. Now, she categorically said that Iran is not building a nuclear weapon. This is a statement that she made to lawmakers back in March, but it was contradicted by U.S. President Donald Trump. I wonder if the position of the National Intelligence Director could weigh in terms of, just opposition towards the current position of the U.S. on the region.
Well, suffice it to say that the Director of National Intelligence does not carry more power than the president, and she can object and has repeatedly objected, but ultimately, as any other official, she can be simply overruled, as we have seen happened directly not once but twice with the president. Now, the bigger issue is whether she actually misled the Congress under oath and misled the president, to whom she is answerable, about the status of the Iranian nuclear program, because other intelligence assessments, including a recent watchdog report, indicate that Iran's nuclear program was quite active. And needless to say, from a political standpoint, it makes no sense that U.S. would pursue negotiations with Iran about the shutdown of the nuclear program and the dismantlement of that nuclear program as any sort of a deal, if there was no indication that Iran in fact had an interest in that and was pursuing something far beyond civilian nuclear program. And there is a substantial difference in the levels of enriched uranium civilian and weaponized programs indicate, and I'm sure that's the sort of information in question right there. So if Tulsi Gabbard single-handedly contradicted all of the independent intelligence assessment by the 18 intelligence agencies, that's a political statement, not an objective intelligence assessment.
Ms. Sukuman, thank you very much for your time and expertise on this conversation. Irina Sukuman is our guest on News Extra today, speaking to the latest out of the Middle East, where the United States of America has launched airstrikes on 3 nuclear facilities in Iran. This is the biggest Western military action against the Islamic Republic since the 1979 Iranian Revolution. And that's News Extra on Radio Now 95.3 FM Lagos. I'm Stephen Imediego, urging you, as always, to stay tuned as conversations continue on your Beyond the News station. In a few short moments, it will be time for the front pages of the dailies on the News Review.
This is Radio Now 95.3 FM. Come for the news, stay for informed conversations.